Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk about one of my favorite aircraft companies and producers of the World War II era, and that is the Curtiss-Wright Corporation. Now, this might seem like an odd choice for one of my favorite companies of that era, since I guess outside of something like the P-40 Warhawk, they weren't really known for making amazing, prolific, and/or high-performing combat aircraft. They kind of just had the P-40, and I guess also the SB-2C Helldiver, but that thing was an absolute disaster in its development. And aside from those planes, their most significant contributions in the war came in the area of parts, engines, and non-combat transport, recon, and training aircraft. But it's because of planes like the Helldiver that I find Curtiss to be absolutely fascinating. Even though they weren't terribly successful in a lot of their ventures, Curtiss tried and tried and tried again to break back into the forefront of combat aircraft, especially in the back half of World War II, proposing all manner of high-power and/or advanced fighters, and dive bombers and torpedo bombers, but it seemed like nothing that they proposed worked out. It was almost like you were watching a car crash, a really, really slow car crash, where the driver ends up walking away and is better off, but their car gets absolutely totaled. After all of their failures to break back into the aircraft market, they eventually decided that enough was enough, and they brought their aircraft design and production wing to a close in the late 1940s. But again, the metaphorical driver here did walk away and was able to continue living on, and Curtiss-Wright still lives on today, making various components for both military and civilian equipment. But this video isn't about their post-war successes. That's not what interests me here. This is about their wartime failures. And for our subject or subjects for today, we have a pair of aircraft from Curtiss that signaled the effective end for the dream of a new Curtiss combat plane in the World War II era. One that was Curtiss's final fighter designed for the US Army Air Force, and another that was one of their final fighters for the US Navy. These are, respectively, the Curtiss XP-62 and the Curtiss XF14C. The stories of both of these fighters begins in early to mid-1941, with a pair of separate but also very similar calls from the Army and the Navy for new, high-performing, and preferably high-altitude fighters. In January 1941, the Army would be the first to the podium with a desire for a fighter that would be powered by what was then the most powerful and heavy engine available to them, in the Wright R-3350 Cyclone. Now, according to the book, U.S. Experimental and Prototype Aircraft Projects by Bill Norton, it was Curtiss that came to the Army with this idea, rather than it being the Army requesting this design and Curtiss then responding. I couldn't actually find any corroboration of what Bill Norton says, but what he said is certainly plausible, as the Wright R-3350 engine was a Curtiss-Wright product, and it is very possible, if not likely, that they wanted to show off the power of this engine, and design a single-engine fighter around it. Regardless of who initiated the project proposal, Curtiss would come to the table in late April 1941 with a new fighter that fit that engine requirement, and also subsequent requirements that the Army added later that made the proposed aircraft a truly terrifying plane. In addition to the R-3350 engine with 2,300 horsepower, the Army wanted a plane that had a top speed of 468 miles an hour at 27,000 feet, with a pressurized cockpit and an armament of 12 50 cal machine guns or 8 20 mil cannons, which, if it was implemented, would make this design probably the most powerful fighter seen in the entirety of World War II. Something like the P-47 that had 8 50 cal machine guns. Something like the F-7F Tiger Cat that served after the war, that had 4 20 mil cannons and 4 50 cal machine guns. Then you have something like the Me-262 that had 4 30 mil cannons. The latter two aircraft here were twin-engine fighters, one of which used jet engines that had more advanced late-war technology, creating a single-engine fighter with 8 20 mil cannons in 1941 would be a pretty impressive achievement, to put it lightly. At least initially, the design that Curtiss presented could fulfill all of these requirements, measuring in at 12.04 meters long, 16.36 meters wide, and 4.95 meters tall. For a single-engine fighter design, it was absolutely massive. Compare it to the notoriously large P-47 Thunderbolt. Curtiss's design here was a good meter longer and 4 meters wider. Its wingspan was more in line with something like a twin-engine heavy fighter. Presumably, this great wingspan was for its potential intended role as a high-altitude fighter, as numerous dedicated high-altitude fighter designs would have significantly increased wingspans. In accordance with these high-altitude wings, the cockpit would be pressurized. Powering their design, also in accordance with the Army specifications, would be the R-3350 with a turbocharger for increased performance at high altitudes. The engine would power a pair of contra-rotating 3-bladed propellers. Likely used as the R-3350 would generate a lot of torque, and having that contra-rotating propeller would help to eliminate some of the negative torque effects, and as a result it would increase stability. For its armament, Curtiss initially elected to go with the 8 20-mil cannons, with 150 rounds per gun. Moving back from the wing, the cockpit would generally follow other Curtiss designs, with the canopy blending into the rear fuselage, although the design here seemed to have less glass on the canopy overall. Due both to the plane's massive engine and its very wide wings, the rear fuselage and tail looked almost comically short and fat, keeping some of the bulk from the front half of the fuselage. The tail surfaces would also look very similar to other Curtiss aircraft, rounded on the top and bottom of the vertical surface. But this new design would also have an extended dorsal section, likely in an effort to further increase stability. But with its overall bulk, Curtiss estimated that its empty weight sat at 11,773 pounds. Curtiss would present their design to the Army on April 29, 1941, and the Army would respond on June 27, 1941, requesting 2 prototypes, to be designated the XP-62 and the XP-62A. The only difference between the two, that the XP-62A was to be the more refined production prototype, and the XP-62 was kind of just the prototype. Ideally, the XP-62 would be delivered in 15 months' time, and the XP-62A would be delivered 3 months after that, presumably to give Curtiss the time that they needed after testing the XP-62 to improve the second prototype. Shortly after the contract for these 2 planes was signed, before any significant work could begin, there were already problems that would delay the delivery of the first prototype and reduce its performance. For the delay, Curtiss quickly learned that they wouldn't be receiving an R-3350 engine configured to run a contra-rotating propeller soon enough to complete the XP-62 in its allotted 15-month time frame. To at least temporarily solve this problem, Curtiss requested that it be outfit initially with a more standard R-3350 engine running a more standard single propeller, and this request was granted. As for the problem that would reduce performance, while having a single prop would at least alter the performance a little bit, Further studying of the design led to Curtiss coming to the realization that, as it currently was, the requested top speed of 468 miles an hour was simply not viable, in part due to the 820mm cannons accounting for much more weight than they anticipated. As a result, the project specifications were revised, with the gross weight being increased by around 1,500 pounds and the top speed being decreased down to 448 miles an hour. Still pretty solid for such a potentially powerful aircraft. By December 1941, the XP-62 mock-up had been completed and was inspected, and some 90 alterations were recommended by the Army. Most notably, and seemingly the only one mentioned today, is that the XP-62 needed to go on a diet. At this stage, its estimated gross weight sat at 15,568 pounds. It was recommended that it should drop down to at least 14,000 pounds to ensure that it could reach its projected speed and stay competitive with other American fighters. As the XP-62 wasn't human, its diet consisted of just ripping some parts out, and Curtiss would remove 4 of the 20mm cannons and a de-icing system for the propeller. Shortly after doing this, Curtiss would go to the Army with a production contract proposal, 100 production model P-62s that would begin delivery in May 1943. This proposal was approved in May 1942, signing a contract for $4.2 million, and now it seemed like Curtiss was on their way to having a new accepted fighter that would serve in the war. But just 2 months later, in July 1942, the 100 model contract got cancelled. This cancellation had almost nothing to do with the performance of the XP-62. I mean, it couldn't have been since it hadn't even taken to the air yet, but instead it had to do with the immediate war effort and what was needed for it. In mid-1942, Curtiss was producing, under subcontract, P-47 Thunderbolts, and producing more of those was the more immediate and pressing need, because the Army was concerned that work on the XP-62 could impede their production of the P-47. The XP-62 needed to, at the very least, be put on the back burner. Adding to this issue was the fact that the R-3350 engine was the same engine that the Boeing B-29 Superfortress used, and that plane, too, was far more pressing at the time. So, as a result of both issues, the contract got cancelled. Still, though, work on the initial 2 prototypes was allowed to proceed, likely so they could test out the pressurized cockpit technology. But with the contract being cancelled, the XP-62's priority became very low. The original 15-month prototype delivery window came to an end in September 1942 without a working prototype. Then the new year came without a working prototype. Valentine's Day, Easter, 4th of July, all of those came and went without a prototype. But finally, on July 21st, 1943, the XP-62 was finally ready, and it would take to the air for the first time. Normally, this is where I would talk about how it performed, but the priority of the project was now so low that they didn't even fully test out the plane's performance capabilities, and the only thing that was really tested was the cockpit pressurization system. After just a few total hours of flight testing, the XP-62A got cancelled in September, and early the next year, the lone XP-62 was grounded, never to return to the air, and it was scrapped shortly thereafter. So this brought a sad and quiet end to a fighter that, at least on paper, might have been a very powerful weapon, and its failure was the effective end for a new Curtiss aircraft in the Army. But what about the Navy project? How was that one going? Going back in time to 1941, the Navy was looking into something that was very unusual for them: an inline liquid-cooled engine. By and large, the Navy stuck very close to radial engines and seldom ever ventured out of that bubble, in part because of the reliability and serviceability of radial engines, and also probably in part because radials were overall more tight and compact, in not needing a separate liquid cooling system. But with the greater aerodynamic potential that inline engines offered, the Navy did occasionally dip their toes into the liquid cooling, and one engine that they were interested in early 1941 was the Lycoming XH-2470, a 24-cylinder H-block experimental engine that was designed to output 2,300 horsepower. Compare this to the XP-62 and its R3350 engine. It output roughly the same power, maybe a little bit more, but the R3350 weighed comfortably over 2,500 pounds, compared to the Lycoming that weighed in just under 2,500 pounds. So more or equal power for slightly less weight, better aerodynamics, but also less ruggedness and durability. Overall, it was a pretty decent trade-off. So for this experimental engine, on June 30th, 1941, the same day, coincidentally, that the Navy issued contracts to Grumman for prototypes of the F-6F Hellcat and F-7F Tigercat, the Navy also awarded a contract to Curtiss for 2 prototype XF14Cs, sticking to their love of radial engines in the 2 former aircraft, and trying to get themselves a high-power inline liquid-cooled fighter in the latter. Unfortunately, as far as I could find, the original XF-14C1 design, that appears to have been lost to time. So for visuals, I'll have to use the XF-14C2, unless of course I end up finding something after I record this, which I probably will. But the original design, likely measuring about the same as the later design, at 11.51 meters long, 14.02 meters wide, and 3.76 meters tall, it looked remarkably similar to the XP-62 in its general shape, size, and stubby fatness. Initially, it's possible but hard to confirm or deny that the XF-14C was planned to use a contra-rotating propeller, just like the XP-62 did. I'm inclined to believe that that was the original plan, since the Lycoming engine would be very powerful and would have a good bit of torque to it, and since Curtiss went with the contra-rotating prop on the XP-62 to reduce the negative torque effects and increase stability, I would assume that Curtiss followed suit on the XF-14C. Regardless, though, of what the initial propeller situation was, it kind of became a moot point not too long after the contract for them was signed. In Curtiss's initial testing and development, powered by the Lycoming engine, with a projected armament of either 650 cal machine guns or 420 mil cannons, either the Navy expected a performance of, or Curtiss projected a performance of, 374 miles an hour at an altitude of 17,000 feet. Whatever the case here was, when the Navy started wind tunnel testing with a scaled-down model of the design, they came to the conclusion that 374 miles an hour would not be reached by this design. Furthermore, issues in developing the Lycoming engine and getting it to output its projected power caused the Navy to cool on it significantly, and by December 1943, with the Lycoming engine still not being available for this project, the Navy would officially cancel the XF-14C1 design. But as Curtiss had made most of the first prototype XF-14C, one of the sides here figured that the work shouldn't go completely to waste, and it would be quickly revived and reworked under the new designation of XF-14C2. This new design would sub out the Lycoming engine and subbed in a familiar face in the Wright R3350 radial engine, with a turbo supercharger for increased high-altitude performance. This engine alteration, of course, necessitated an alteration in the nose and front half of the fuselage, to increase the airflow for the radial engine, but also to keep the nose as aerodynamic as possible. The opening behind the propeller was very narrow. For the turbo supercharger, a small air intake would be installed under the nose, and on either side of the cowling at the wing roots would be a pair of air intakes for the oil coolers. With this new setup, with a gross weight of 13,405 pounds, and with an engine that actually ended up being successful, Curtiss would project an excellent top speed of 424 miles an hour at 32,000 feet. And in July 1944, this new prototype would take to the air for the first time. And it performed relatively decently, I guess, but not to the level that Curtiss or the Navy had anticipated. The actual top speed fell nearly 30 miles an hour what they had anticipated, sitting at 398 miles an hour, and somewhere between the engine and its contra-rotating propellers, there was a problem, and this led to significant vibrations that would need to be fixed. But at this point, with the Navy not really needing a high-altitude fighter at this stage of the war in mid-1944, Japan didn't really have all that much in the way of high-altitude aircraft, and with the B-29 Superfortress dominating the R-3350 engine market, there was no real point in continuing the XF14C, and as a result, it would be cancelled again. Curtiss did try one last time to save the project, though. Not necessarily as a combat aircraft, but probably more so as a technology demonstrator. Curtiss would push the Navy to agree to the XF-14C-3, which was basically the same as the two, but with a pressurized cockpit that allowed it to fly up past 40,000 feet. Surprisingly, this was actually accepted, and for the rest of 1944 and into 1945, Curtiss would work on this high-altitude model. Nothing appears to have ever come from it, though, and sometime in 1945, the project was cancelled for the third time, and the XF-14C was now officially dead. So, with the failure of these two aircraft, I do think we can see a bit of a pattern with Curtiss, where and why they ended up failing. It seemed to be a combination of overpromising, delays, and just plain old bad luck and bad timing. Curtiss seemed to promise amazing performance, and amazing performance seemed to be expected from the military, and the actual performance didn't live up to those promises. Then the equipment that they planned on using either encountered problems, delays, or roadblocks in their deliveries, and then barring all of that, when they actually got the design up and running, whether it was because of its more disappointing performance or because of various external issues, the military just ended up not wanting their designs anymore. But give credit where it is due. Curtiss, not too long after these failures, decided that, well, they weren't going to stay where they weren't wanted anymore, and they stopped designing aircraft. They took their ball and went home, and that was kind of the correct move. They still exist today. That has to account for something. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, do you have something that you really enjoy, but also fully acknowledge isn't very good? Because the other day, I bought the Yu-Gi-Oh! Early Days collection, specifically for the Sacred Cards game, a game on the Game Boy Advance that I fully admit is not a great game, but I absolutely love it and bought the collection solely for it. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is very nostalgic for me anyways. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.